I want you to picture this for a moment. 9 capital cities, 9 skies pierced by state-launched airstrikes in a single year. From Kyiv to Tel Aviv, from Moscow to Tehran. This is not a trailer for a dystopian film. This is the world we are already living in. For decades, we believed that large-scale war was an exception, a failure of diplomacy, a breakdown to be repaired. But the latest global risk assessment tells a more unsettling story. Conflict is no longer the anomaly. It is becoming the system. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to help you see clearly. Because when violence becomes routine, the most dangerous thing is not panic, it's normalization. And once that happens, even democratic societies stop asking the right questions. If understanding power, risk, and the forces shaping your future matters to you, stay with me. What we're about to unpack isn't noise, it's a warning signal. Now, let's step back and define exactly what this moment really is. What, then, is the problem we're actually facing? It's not just that there are more wars, it's that the logic governing conflict has changed. According to the latest risk assessment, a majority of plausible conflict scenarios now have a greater than 50% chance of occurring within a single year. That statistic alone should stop us cold. The world is experiencing the highest number of active conflicts since World War II, but this isn't a simple return to old-style great wars. Instead, we're seeing something more unstable. Overlapping crises, regional wars bleeding into global ones, and major powers edging closer to direct confrontation, often without declaring it as such. At the same time, fragile states are burning quietly in the background. Civil wars marked by mass atrocities are deemed likely, even inevitable, yet they barely register as priorities, not because they aren't tragic, but because they're judged to matter less to US interests. This creates a dangerous imbalance. Normalization at the center, neglect at the margins. To understand how we arrived here, we have to look backward into the forces and decisions that set this cycle in motion. To see how this cycle began, we have to understand the background that shaped it. For years, the international system rested on a fragile assumption that norms against aggression would hold even when power shifted. That assumption is now breaking down. Long-standing disputes, India and Pakistan over Kashmir, Cambodia and Thailand over territory, never truly ended. They simply went dormant, waiting for pressure to return. At the same time, the global focus narrowed. As interstate violence resurfaced, internal conflicts in fragile states were pushed aside. Sudan's civil war, the most likely scenario to escalate, according to experts, became a symbol of this neglect, catastrophic in human terms, yet ranked low in strategic priority. The same pattern appears in South Sudan and the Sahel. Overlay this with renewed rivalry among major powers. The United States, China, and Russia are no longer just influencing conflicts at a distance. They are increasingly identified as direct actors or potential aggressors. This is how instability becomes cyclical. Old conflicts persist, new ones emerge, and the system stops correcting itself. And then, inevitably, pressure finds a breaking point. The breaking point arrived quietly then, all at once. In a single year, interstate violence crossed a line that had held imperfectly for decades. Direct confrontations replaced proxy ambiguity. Airstrikes hit 9 capital cities, not border towns, not remote outposts, capitals, centers of power, symbols of sovereignty. What made this moment different wasn't just the scale, it was the precedent. When the United States, Iran, and Israel clashed directly in June, the message was unmistakable. Restraint is no longer assumed. Escalation is no longer unthinkable. At the same time, other conflicts intensified in parallel. Russia and Ukraine expanded attacks on critical infrastructure. Long-running disputes reignited with new urgency. The system didn't pause to absorb one shock before the next arrived. Crises stacked on top of each other. And here's the deeper meaning. When multiple actors cross red lines simultaneously, deterrence stops being predictable. it becomes reactive, emotional, dangerous. If you're trying to make sense of why the world suddenly feels less stable, less governable, this is the moment to pay attention. Because once norms break publicly, they rarely snap back. What matters now is understanding what's really driving this behavior beneath the surface. Beneath the headlines, a quieter mechanism is doing the real damage. What we're witnessing isn't chaos by accident. It's the result of systems designed for a different era, now operating under new pressures. Prevention institutions have been weakened, early warning capacity has shrunk, and conflict management has become reactive rather than anticipatory. At the same time, strategic priorities have narrowed. U.S. attention has shifted toward conflicts judged to have direct national impact, while others, Sudan, Haiti, the Sahel, are effectively triaged. Violence in these places is treated as background risk, not a trigger for action. Add to this a critical paradox. The United States still possesses unmatched influence, yet it is exercising it inconsistently. In some regions, it intervenes directly. In others, it disengages. The result is not clarity, but uncertainty for allies and adversaries alike. This inconsistency is what destabilizes the system. When rules appear selective, actors test boundaries. When consequences feel uneven, escalation becomes rational. And once that logic takes hold, it doesn't stay contained. It accelerates toward another flashpoint. That next flashpoint is already forming, and it's more volatile than the last. Experts now see several scenarios with both a high likelihood and a high impact converging at once. An intensification of the Russia-Ukraine war, renewed large-scale violence in Gaza, U.S. military strikes escalating into direct action inside Venezuela. Each on its own would strain the global system. Together, they compress decision time and multiply risk. What's striking is how little margin for error remains. Attacks on infrastructure and population centers blur the line between military targets and civilian life. Political leaders are forced to respond faster, often with incomplete information, under intense domestic pressure. This is the second crisis moment. Not a single explosion, but a sustained acceleration. Conflict is no longer episodic, it's persistent. And persistence changes behavior. Governments plan for confrontation as a baseline, not a contingency. If this feels overwhelming, it should. Because the danger isn't just where violence erupts, but how quickly it can spread when the system is already saturated. And that brings us to the most overlooked dimension of all, what this means for ordinary people. If you're wondering where you fit into all of this, here's the uncomfortable truth. You're no longer a distant observer. When conflict becomes constant, it quietly reaches into everyday life. Energy prices fluctuate, supply chains fracture, migration pressures rise, governments expand security measures, and slowly freedoms are traded for a sense of control. You may not hear bombs, but you feel the aftershocks. For people living inside these conflict zones, the cost is immediate and brutal. Homes become front lines. Infrastructure becomes a target. Survival replaces planning. But even far from the battlefield, societies absorb the stress through fear, polarization, and exhaustion. This is how global instability becomes personal. Not overnight, but gradually, invisibly. If you've ever felt that the world seems more tense, more divided, more fragile than it used to be, you're not imagining it. You're sensing a system under strain. And if this perspective helps you see the bigger picture more clearly, share it. These conversations matter because understanding is the first form of resilience. Now, let's widen the lens, because what happens next won't stay contained within borders. Zoom out, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. When conflicts escalate simultaneously across regions, their effects don't cancel out, they compound. A war in Eastern Europe tightens energy markets. Violence in the Middle East reshapes global diplomacy. Tensions in East Asia force militaries to recalibrate across entire oceans, What looks like regional instability is in reality a single interconnected system under stress. Major powers are watching each other closely. Every move sets a precedent. Every intervention sends a signal. A strike in one theater changes calculations in another. This is why experts are deeply concerned about flashpoints like the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula, not because conflict there is inevitable, but because miscalculation elsewhere makes restraint harder everywhere. Meanwhile, fragile states become amplifiers. Crises in places like Sudan, Haiti, or the DRC may rank low in strategic priority, but their humanitarian fallout, displacement, extremism, economic shock travels far beyond their borders. This is how global instability spreads, not as a single chain reaction, but as overlapping waves. And once the world reaches this level of saturation, the future stops being linear. It fractures into scenarios. What happens next depends on which path the system takes, and there are only a few that remain plausible. The first scenario is the optimistic one. Major powers recognize how close they are to the edge and pull back, selectively. Conflict doesn't disappear, but escalation is contained. Diplomatic pressure intensifies around the most dangerous flashpoints, Ukraine, Gaza, Taiwan, while US leverage is applied more strategically, not everywhere, but where it still matters most. Stability in this version is not peace. It's managed tension. The second scenario is the middle path. Violence continues at today's pace. Wars grind on. New crises emerge, but none are decisive enough to reset the system. This is a world of permanent instability, governable but exhausting. Governments normalize emergency thinking. Societies adapt to anxiety as background noise. The third scenario is the dark one. A single miscalculation, one strike too far, triggers cascading escalation. Alliances harden, direct confrontations widen. The distinction between high and low impact conflicts collapses. History tells us something crucial here. Systems rarely collapse because of one shock. They collapse because pressure accumulates unnoticed. Which future we move toward depends on choices being made right now, often out of public view. And that brings us to the final question. What are we supposed to do with this knowledge? Here's the insight that ties everything together. The world is not becoming more violent because leaders want chaos. It's becoming more violent because the cost of restraint now feels higher than the risk of escalation. When norms erode, when prevention weakens, when power is exercised unevenly, conflict stops being a failure of the system and becomes its default output. That doesn't mean the future is fixed. It means awareness matters, because public understanding shapes political pressure. And political pressure shapes choices where resources go, which conflicts are prioritized, which risks are taken seriously before they explode. If you take one thing away from this, let it be this. Global stability doesn't collapse in dramatic moments. It erodes quietly, while attention drifts and urgency fades. If this analysis helped you see the world a little more clearly, stay with me, share it, engage with it. The next video will dig deeper into where intervention still works and where it might already be too late. Because in a world this unstable, clarity is no longer optional.